Okay, I want to talk about this painting. It is from a snapshot from the out the bus window in Florence as we were traveling from the villa to church, I think one Sunday morning, and the light was hitting that orb sticking out from the wall and casting that shadow, and so it was literally on the fly. I snapped the photograph out the bus window, and I really don't remember. It's probably a year later because it was '05 that I was there. That was the summer that we had 20 art majors at the villa. It was the first international program dedicated to a program to majors. We had 22 art majors, 10 non-majors. Dr. Choate, myself, and Mrs. Austin were the teachers, and Tessa Davidson was one of the students of that group. I have a story to tell you in another time about Tessa Davidson's hunger for knowledge, but I'll save that. Won't do that on the video here. So the reason I wanted to share this with you guys is because the other day I was talking to somebody about laying down a flat wash over a large area. Who was that? How do you lay down a flat wash and really get it flat? No brushwork whatsoever. It's not that often in watercolor that you want to do that. In fact, it may be that you never want to do it. But in this case, that Tuscan yellow, with that sun hitting it, I wanted that to be flat. I wanted absolutely no brush strokes. And so that was my challenge. And the smartest thing I did on this was use cold pressed paper, not hot pressed. Hot pressed paper would have worked really well because of the crisp, hard edge definition of everything. That would lend itself to hot pressed paper. But hot pressed paper, doing this sphere, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, that was the hardest part of the painting right there. Doing the sphere and doing the flat yellow background were the only hard things in this. The rest is just paint by number, piece of cake. So the question I have, and maybe the only question, is what did I, and I'll tell you a little secret, I did use some masking on this. I did. I protected some of the painting so I could do the yellow real fast. So what did I protect on this painting? Think about it a little bit, knowing what you know about watercolor. What areas, what did I mask off or use Misket to protect before I did the background? Any volunteers? The what? The orb. Actually, yes, the orb. Anything else? No one? Well, there were actually 3 items that I felt like I had to protect because I didn't want the yellow underpainting color. This little sliver of what appears to be a clock or an outdoor thermometer, and this gray, looks like it's just a vent of something in a blower, an exhaust thing is what it looks like over here, and the orb. Everything else was painted, the whole page, the whole sheet was painted just yellow. So I did use Misket around the perimeter, and then just a little bit around the perimeter, and then I filled it in with masking tape from there. Same thing on this, and the same thing over here. So I've got those 3 areas blocked off, and I knew I needed a lot of paint. It just wasn't going to do to mix a little puddle of paint and then try to match it on the fly. You know enough now about running out of color and trying to match that color again. To cover this whole sheet of paper, I was going to need a pretty good quantity of paint. I didn't want to run out, so I was on the safe side. I took a quart jar and I filled it about a third, somewhere between a third and a half full of water, and used nearly a tube of Naples Yellow paint. Used a lot of paint to get that water, the color, the intensity that I wanted it. But in fact, I still have what's left over, which is a good part of that quart jar, somewhere in my basement. I never threw it away, I don't think. It's still sitting there waiting for me to do some other painting. So I mixed up a pretty large quantity of that color. It's not straight Naples Yellow. Naples Yellow is a little more like a manila folder. So this isn't, that Tuscan Yellow wasn't yellow, it wasn't Naples Yellow. By the way, I think Naples Yellow is probably named for that color on the houses, the villas throughout Italy. I think there's only 3 colors they're allowed to paint their structures in Italy. There's a reddish, orangish kind of a color, and this Tuscan Yellow, and I think the other is kind of a beige. I don't remember the third one. But by law, that's what you paint your houses, I understand. So I had those areas covered, and I had this jar of paint. Well, my little 1-inch brush, that's my biggest watercolor brush that I use for most of my work, is just a 1-inch brush. For most of the flat washes I do, a 1-inch brush is going to be big enough. Not for this. I actually ended up using a Dick Blick, I think it's a 3-inch brush. I picked it up on sale at a National Art Convention because they sell them real cheap there to get teachers' interest. So I've got several really big brushes, and I believe that's what I use. So I was using a 3-inch brush and a jar half full of Naples Yellow. Well, so then how do I get it uniformly on there without any brush strokes? I just moisten the paper, laying flat, I moisten the paper, brushed over it, brushed that water around a little bit. I got it to soak in a little bit. Then I did it again, and then I kind of I wiped off the surface water because I didn't want any wet on wet. I wanted flat, like a yellow piece of paper. And so the paper was moist. I had a large quantity of water, and then I simply brushed across, back and forth. Probably took me no more than a minute to paint the entire sheet the color I wanted it, because I had a large quantity mixed up. It was already, paper was already wet, so it was receiving the paint evenly, and where it didn't receive it, it ran into those areas, and I had a big brush. Very famous watercolorist O'Hara stated that you can do is pour a painting with a little brush as a big brush. It just takes longer. The point he was trying to make was you always use the biggest brush you can when you're watercoloring. Well, that's true if you are what I call a watercolorist watercolorer, an Elliot O'Hara or a Theodore Kotsky or a Sargent, you know, those watercolorists who's real loose and spontaneous. Still, the large brush is what you want for those styles. If you're a detail artist, and there are several of you in here that really love detail, that rule of thumb maybe doesn't work too well. All right, so I have a pure yellow sheet of paper. Take the masking tape off, take the misket off, and then it's just a simple matter of drawing onto that. And I tell you the truth, I did have almost all the drawing done at that time. The drawing of this piece of iron sticking out from the wall and the shadow on the wall had to be right, perspective-wise, to feel like a cast shadow. So that was a pretty critical part. So the question I had then was, why on earth would I want to include this stuff around the perimeter? It's not about that. Wouldn't this have been a better painting had I had this vast area of orange, the hint of shadow up here at the eave, and the lamp coming out, and just let the yellow run off the page, top and side, or bottom and sides? Thought about that, and I thought, no, it really needs something to anchor it, even as ambiguous as those objects are. And so I went ahead and included these things that just happened to be arbitrarily in a snapshot. I didn't leave them there because they were there. I left them there because they, compositionally, they help anchor. They kind of rotate around it. And I just felt like I needed something, and what else to put? Why add, why invent something? So I decided to leave those in there. In fact, my title for this painting is Ambiguity. Ambiguity? Yeah. Because these ambiguous little things around the perimeter, you know, what is this? What is that? This appears to be the top of the door. This always reminds me of the bottom of the Last Supper, when a doorway was cut through the bottom of that painting to make way for... Actually, there are two stories on that. One is that it was used for soldiers to move their horses in and out. The other is that, no, it was easier access to the kitchen. The Last Supper's in a dining hall. Well, off topic here. So, a hint of the roof line, the tiles up here, and I went ahead and did this with a, you probably can't see this in my video, but this light and shadow, this is extremely dark shadow up here, but there is a little bit of purple color in it. Why purple? Pretty obvious, isn't it? The yellow and the complement. So it was really easy to put this flat wash, all this, these gradations, all this stuff was piece of cake. I really struggled with this circle because of the cleanness of everything. I really didn't want this to be a wet on, I needed to be wet on wet, but it didn't need to be a loose, let the watercolor go where it wants to go. It needed to be controlled. And I didn't want to build it up with glazes because that wasn't consistent with anything else. So I had to model this form with the wet on wet technique. And it took me a while actually to get this to where I was reasonably happy with it. I'm still not as happy with the sphere as I would like to have been. The rest of it I'm okay with. Anyway, any questions? Pretty straightforward stuff. It's kind of like a paint by number, if you will. That's not a good analogy or parallel to make with one's paintings, but it really is just painting in shapes. Well, flat wash. That's the ultimate flat wash for me.